October 14th, 1962. Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev sits alone in his Kremlin office, reading a telegram that would bring the world closer to nuclear war than it had ever been. But the message isn't from Washington or Havana. It's from a remote sugarcane plantation in Cuba, where 42,000 Soviet soldiers are living under a lie so elaborate that most of them don't even know where they are. They think they're in a place called Anadyr, somewhere in the frozen Arctic. Instead, they're 90 miles from Florida, assembling medium-range ballistic missiles capable of vaporizing American cities in minutes. Imagine being one of those soldiers, told you're heading to the Soviet Arctic for a routine deployment, only to find yourself sweating in tropical heat, forbidden to remove your winter uniforms. The deception began 6 months earlier. In April 1962, Khrushchev made a decision that would define the Cold War's most dangerous moment. The Bay of Pigs invasion had failed the year before, but American pressure on Castro's Cuba continued mounting. Soviet intelligence reported that another invasion seemed inevitable. Khrushchev faced a dilemma: lose Cuba and watch American influence creep closer to Soviet borders, or take a gamble that could spark World War III. The solution came from Defense Minister Rodion Malinovsky. If the Americans could place Jupiter missiles in Turkey, aimed at Soviet cities, why couldn't the Soviets do the same in Cuba? But this couldn't be a public deployment. It had to be secret, swift, and complete before the Americans discovered it. Once the missiles were operational, Khrushchev would reveal them to the world as a fait accompli. They called it Operation Anadyr, named after a remote river in Siberia. Every document, every briefing, every conversation would reference this fictional Arctic deployment. Soldiers received winter gear and Arctic survival training. Maps showed Siberian coastlines. Even the operations logistics officer didn't learn the true destination until his ship crossed the Atlantic. The Soviets would transport 85 ships carrying not just missiles, but nuclear warheads, jet fighters, tanks, and enough equipment to establish a permanent military presence 90 miles from American shores. The scale of deception was breathtaking. 42,000 military personnel, more troops than the Soviets had deployed anywhere outside their borders since World War II, would vanish from official records. Their families were told they were heading north to Murmansk, then on to classified Arctic installations. Letters home would be censored and redirected through Soviet Arctic postal systems. The men themselves wouldn't learn their destination until their ships reached Cuban waters. The first ships departed Soviet ports in July 1962. The passengers wore winter uniforms despite temperatures reaching 90 degrees Fahrenheit. Soviet commanders had calculated that American spy satellites might photograph the ships, and winter clothing would reinforce the Arctic deception. Soldiers collapsed from heat exhaustion on deck, but orders were absolute. No removal of winter gear above decks. Captain Ivan Sidorov commanded one of the freighters carrying R-12 medium-range ballistic missiles. His sealed orders, opened only after reaching international waters, revealed a destination that contradicted everything in his briefing materials. Cuba, not the Arctic. Nuclear missiles, not construction equipment. A secret deployment that could trigger nuclear war. The American intelligence apparatus had detected unusual Soviet activity, but the Anadyr deception was working. CIA analysts noted increased shipping to Cuba, but interpreted it as conventional defensive weapons, surface-to-air missiles, patrol boats, perhaps some tanks. The pattern seemed consistent with standard Soviet military aid to allied nations. From Washington's viewpoint, Khrushchev seemed to be making rational, limited moves to protect Cuba, exactly what American planners would expect after the Bay of Pigs. By September, Soviet engineers were clearing sugarcane fields and constructing missile sites across western Cuba. The R-12 missiles, known to NATO as SS-4 Sandals, had a range of 1,000 miles. They could strike targets from Washington to New Orleans in 17 minutes. Longer-range R-16 missiles, still in transit, could reach any city in the continental United States. But maintaining the deception grew increasingly difficult. Soviet soldiers, still wearing winter uniforms, worked construction jobs in 100-degree heat. Local Cubans, briefed on the cover story, struggled to understand why Arctic specialists needed to build installations in tropical Cuba. American U-2 spy flights were increasing. Colonel Oleg Penkovsky, a Soviet military intelligence officer secretly working for the CIA, was reporting unusual troop movements, though he didn't yet grasp their full scope. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Refugee reports from Cuba mentioned unusual construction activity and foreign workers who seemed distinctly un-Cuban. CIA photo interpreters began requesting more detailed U-2 missions over western Cuba. October 14, 1962. Major Richard Heiser piloted his U-2 reconnaissance aircraft over western Cuba on what seemed like a routine surveillance mission. Flying at 70,000 feet, his cameras captured images that would change history. How many decisions in your lifetime have been made by someone analyzing blurry photographs, knowing that a wrong interpretation could start a nuclear war? The photographs showed clear evidence of medium-range ballistic missile sites under construction near San Cristobal. Unlike surface-to-air missiles, these installations had the distinctive signature of offensive nuclear weapons, the kind designed to strike cities, not shoot down aircraft. CIA photo interpreters worked through the night, comparing the images to known Soviet missile installations in Eastern Europe. The match was unmistakable. President Kennedy received the briefing on October 16th. The photos revealed not just missiles, but the infrastructure of a permanent Soviet nuclear presence in the Western Hemisphere. General Marshall Carter, acting CIA director, estimated the missiles would be operational within 2 weeks. Once functional, they would represent a fundamental shift in nuclear balance. Soviet warheads that could strike American cities faster than intercontinental ballistic missiles launched from Soviet territory. The Cuban Missile Crisis had begun. But in Cuba, Soviet forces continued operating under the Anadyr deception. Many soldiers still believed they were part of an Arctic deployment, somehow relocated for tropical training exercises. Radio communications continued using Arctic code names and geographic references. Supply requisitions referenced Siberian weather conditions. Soviet forces in Cuba included not only ballistic missiles, but 98 nuclear warheads, more atomic firepower than Britain and France combined possessed at the time. Kennedy faced impossible choices. Military advisors pushed for immediate airstrikes, followed by invasion. Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara calculated that such action would trigger nuclear retaliation, possibly escalating to global war. The Soviets, meanwhile, had positioned tactical nuclear weapons with their ground forces, a detail American intelligence wouldn't discover until decades later. On October 22nd, Kennedy announced the naval quarantine of Cuba. Soviet ships approaching Cuban waters would be stopped and searched. Khrushchev faced his own terrible choice: back down and appear weak, or push forward and risk nuclear war. The Anadyr deception, so carefully constructed, had become irrelevant. The missiles were discovered. The crisis was public. The next 6 days brought the world closer to nuclear war than any period before or since. Soviet submarines, armed with nuclear torpedoes, approached the quarantine line. On October 27th, Soviet surface-to-air missiles shot down Major Rudolf Anderson's U-2 aircraft over Cuba. American military leaders demanded immediate retaliation. The resolution came through secret negotiations that wouldn't be fully revealed for decades. Kennedy agreed privately to remove Jupiter missiles from Turkey in exchange for Soviet withdrawal from Cuba. Publicly, Khrushchev would appear to back down in exchange for American promises not to invade Cuba. The Anadyr deception, which had hidden the deployment, now provided cover for the withdrawal. What if the secret negotiations had failed? Soviet tactical nuclear weapons in Cuba were armed and ready. Local commanders had authority to use them if invaded. By December 1962, Soviet ships were carrying missiles, warheads, and most personnel back to Arctic ports. The operation that had never officially existed was ending. Soldiers who had spent months in tropical heat while wearing winter uniforms found themselves actually deployed to Arctic bases, the fictional Anadyr becoming their real destination. The human cost of the deception extended beyond the crisis itself. Soviet families had endured months of uncertainty, told their relatives were deployed to remote Arctic installations with limited communication. Some soldiers suffered psychological trauma from the elaborate deception. Months of being told they were in one place while living in another, forbidden from acknowledging reality even in private conversations. Captain Ivan Sidorov returned to Murmansk in January 1963. His official service record showed continuous Arctic deployment. His personal knowledge of bringing nuclear weapons to Cuba became a state secret he would carry for 30 years. Like thousands of others, he was sworn to silence about an operation that officially never happened. Operation Anadyr reveals how easily nations can stumble toward catastrophe through deception, miscalculation, and the momentum of secret operations. 42,000 Soviet military personnel became unwitting participants in the most dangerous gamble of the nuclear age. Their families lived with lies. Their government bet civilization on a bluff. The operation succeeded in its deception, but failed in its larger purpose. Instead of presenting America with a fait accompli, it created the Cuban Missile Crisis. Instead of strengthening Soviet strategic position, it nearly triggered nuclear war. The elaborate fiction of an Arctic deployment became a monument to how easily truth becomes casualty in great power competition. In our current age of global tensions and nuclear proliferation, what lessons from Anadyr do we choose to remember, and which ones do we prefer to forget? Today, most of the Soviet personnel from Operation Anadyr are gone. Their secret has become history. But the fundamental danger they embodied, the ease with which nuclear powers can misread each other's intentions, the speed with which diplomatic crises can escalate beyond control, remains as relevant as ever. The Arctic deception is over. The nuclear age continues.